Oil, the black gold that powers the world as we know it. Its history is interwoven with the rise of modern industrial civilization, shaping economies, wars, technologies, and that one tag on adult sites that I can't mention because we are not 1 minute into the video yet. But before it became the global powerhouse that it is today, oil was little more than a curiosity seeping from the earth in random places. Ancient cultures utilised it for various purposes, such as waterproofing and medicinal remedies. But its true potential was largely overlooked. It wasn't until the 19th century that oil began to be recognised as a vital energy source. The advent of the internal combustion engine ignited an insatiable demand, propelling the oil industry into a frenzy of exploration and extraction. As drilling technology advanced, companies ventured deeper into the earth and even deeper beneath the oceans, pursuing new reserves to meet global needs. This relentless pursuit, however, came with inherent risks, culminating in cataclysmic events that would forever change the course of history. Deepwater Horizon. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. Hey there, big guy. Sorry to pull you aside like this and interrupt that weird ginger fella from telling you about some kooky stuff, but you see, I really feel like I have to spend a moment of your time to tell you about something. About your boy, Raid Shadow Legends. That is right, the gaming sensation is back and better than ever, right in time for the holiday season, and let me tell you, now is a better time than ever to take that dive and start playing today. What's that? What's Raid Shadow Legends? Why, it is only the premier gaming experience. Though once merely shackled to mobile, Raid Shadow Legends is now completely cross-platform. And don't get it twisted, it still has that AAA finish and polish on top of its gripping and in-depth gameplay loop. Now look, I get it, a game with this amount of content and strategy might come off as a bit overwhelming if you're just starting out. We were all there after all, so Raid has charitably decided to start giving away 2 epic heroes for free. So how do you get it? Well, you simply scan the QR code on the top of the screen or click the link in the description box down below. But hold your horses there, Chuck. It somehow gets even better. That's right, if you register today and use promo code Monkey King, you will additionally get access to the legendary hero Sun Wukong, the aforementioned Monkey King. And let me tell you a few things about him. First things first, he can steal all buffs from enemies before attacking them, meaning any power-ups the ops get a hold of will be instantly nullified. From there, he can hit with his Staff of Wonders, which ignores 50% of a target's defense stats, and then spill the excess damage to other enemies when your target dies. That is to say, he is really good, and I seriously wish I had him when I first started out because he is literally me. So come and find me under Count Dankula TV and please join my clan, the Dank Brigade, so that I can have access to more Monkey Kings. He's very good and I need that edge. To get access to this absolute steal of a deal, you need to click the link in the description box down below or scan the QR code on the screen and use code MONKEYKING to get access to Sun Wukong for free, alongside 2 amazing starter packs with epic champions, Uugo and Fayne after hitting level 15. And Raid very kindly has a package for returning players. By clicking the welcome back link in the description box down below, returning players will get access to the champion Taguarm, alongside a myriad of other bonuses. But again, that's exclusive to returning players who click the welcome back link in the description. And now, back to the video. But before we get into the event itself, let's have a bit of a history lesson. In 1859, Edwin Drake, an American businessman, drilled what would become the world's first successful oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Using a steam engine and rudimentary drilling tools, Drake struck oil at a depth of just 69 feet. By today's women's standards, that would be considered a normal-sized operation, yet its impact would be anything but. This well, often referred to as Drake's Folly, sparked a massive oil rush, transforming the small town of Titusville and marking the birth of the modern petroleum industry in the United States. At first, oil had a singular purpose: to fuel kerosene lamps, replacing the expensive and scarce whale oil that had been widely used for lighting. But as the 19th century drew to a close, new technologies began to emerge. Electricity, the internal combustion engine, and eventually the automobile. By the early 20th century, oil was no longer just a luxury, it was a necessity. So the search for oil intensified, with explorers and companies drilling deeper and wider across the American landscape. In Texas, the 1901 discovery of Spindletop, a gusher that spewed oil 150 feet into the air, confirmed that America's oil reserves were vast. Spindletop alone produced more oil than all of the other wells in the United States combined. And it marked the dawn of the Texas oil boom. From Pennsylvania to California to the Gulf Coast, oil was changing the face of America. But even as vast oil fields were uncovered on land, there were limits to just how much could be extracted. The oil companies were running out of easily accessible locations, so the next step was clear: the ocean. By the early 20th century, oil prospectors began experimenting with drilling in shallow waters. In 1896, the first known offshore well was drilled from a wooden pier in Summerland, California. The well extended over the Pacific Ocean and tapped into oil located beneath the seabed. While primitive by today's standards, it was the first attempt to extract oil from beneath the ocean floor, and it proved that offshore oil drilling was possible. In the decades that followed, technology improved and offshore drilling expanded. In 1938, Humble Oil, which later became part of ExxonMobil, drilled a successful offshore well in the Gulf of Mexico, using a barge-mounted rig. Unlike the shallow water wells off of California, this was a true offshore well, drilled out of sight of land and completely reliant on floating equipment. But even this was just the beginning. As oil demand continued to rise in the mid-20th century, so too did the need for more advanced drilling technologies. Fixed platforms which stood on tall legs anchored to the seabed were initially the most common method for offshore drilling. These platforms allowed oil companies to drill in the shallow waters of up to 100 feet, but the deeper waters of the Gulf of Mexico and other regions posed much greater challenges. In 1947, the Kerr-McGee Corporation built the world's first offshore oil platform that was completely out of sight of land, off the coast of Louisiana. This platform was anchored in just 20 feet of water, but it signaled the beginning of a new era in oil exploration. Offshore drilling was no longer a matter of just drilling from piers or close to shore. Oil companies were now beginning to venture out into deeper waters. By the 1950s, offshore drilling technology had advanced enough to allow rigs to operate in water over 100 feet deep. One of the most significant innovations came in 1956 with the introduction of the Mr. Charlie, a submersible drilling rig built by the Ocean Drilling and Exploration Company. Mr. Charlie was essentially a floating barge that could be towed to a drilling site, and its lower hull would sink into the seabed, providing a stable platform for drilling in water of up to 40 feet deep. This innovation set the stage for future developments. As the oil industry pushed further offshore, so came the limitations of fixed platforms. Deepwater drilling required new technologies. The answer was the development of semi-submersible rigs which floated on the surface of the ocean but used massive anchors or dynamic positioning systems to stay in place over the wellhead. These rigs were much more flexible and could operate in much deeper waters than fixed platforms. The next big leap came in the 1960s and 70s as the first truly deep-water rigs were designed and deployed. Rigs like the Sedco and the Glomar Challenger were capable of drilling in waters over 1,000 feet deep, thanks to innovations like dynamic positioning systems which allowed the rigs to remain precisely above the wellhead without the need for anchors. These rigs relied on GPS and computer-controlled thrusters to maintain their positions in the open sea, no matter the conditions. Drilling technology continued to improve again throughout the 80s and the 90s, allowing for even deeper wells and even more remote drilling operations. At the heart of deepwater drilling was the need to control the immense pressures found at these extreme depths. The deeper the well, the greater the pressure from the oil, gas and water trapped beneath the seabed. To handle these extreme pressures, oil companies used a system called drilling mud, which is a heavy fluid that was pumped down the wellbore to maintain balance between the pressures inside the well and the surrounding rock. In addition, a critical piece of technology called the blowout preventer, or the BOP, became standard equipment on all deepwater rigs. The BOP was a massive valve system that was placed on the seabed above the well. If the pressure inside the well became too great, the BOP could be activated to close the well and prevent a blowout, which is an uncontrolled release of oil and gas. We've all been there. That was a shit joke. By the late 1990s and the early 2000s, offshore drilling had reached unprecedented depths. Oil companies were now exploring ultra-deepwater fields, drilling in waters over 5,000 feet deep and pushing their equipment to the limits. These deepwater rigs were marvels of engineering, combining advanced navigation systems, high-powered pumps, and incredibly precise drilling tools to reach oil reserves that had been previously thought to be completely unreachable. One of the most significant advancements in offshore drilling was the introduction of dynamically positioned rigs and floating platforms that used computerized thrusters to stay in place over the wellhead, even in high winds or rough seas. These rigs didn't need to be anchored to the sea floor, which meant they could operate in much deeper waters. This combination of dynamic positioning and deepwater drilling tools allowed rigs to reach depths of over 30,000 feet below the seabed, extracting oil from some of the most remote and challenging locations on Earth. As the 21st century began, deepwater drilling was more critical than ever. With many of the world's largest land-based oil fields now in decline, oil companies were forced to explore the frontiers of the deep ocean. The Gulf of Mexico became the main point of interest for deepwater exploration, with rigs drilling some of the deepest oil wells in history. By the late 2000s, the oil industry had reached the pinnacle of offshore drilling technology. The quest for oil had pushed engineers and scientists to develop machines capable of operating in the most extreme environments on Earth, miles from shore and thousands of feet beneath the ocean's surface. At the forefront of this technological frontier was a rig that would become infamous for both its incredible capabilities and the disaster that would follow. Deepwater Horizon. Deepwater Horizon was a floating semi-submersible drilling rig built for ultra-deepwater exploration. Its story began in 1998 when the Swiss-based company Transocean, one of the largest offshore drilling contractors in the world, commissioned the rig. At the time, Transocean was looking to expand its fleet of cutting-edge rigs capable of tapping into oil reserves located in some of the deepest waters on the planet. Deepwater Horizon was designed to be just that, a technological marvel built to withstand the rigours of deep-sea drilling. Constructed in 2001 by Hyundai Heavy Industries at its shipyard in Ulsan, South Korea, Deepwater Horizon was part of a new generation of rigs. It was built at a cost of $365 million, a staggering investment that reflected the industry's confidence in deepwater drilling. The rig was designed to operate in water depths of up to 10,000 feet and drill wells as deep as 30,000 feet below the ocean floor. To put that into perspective, that's taller than Mount Everest. Deepwater Horizon was classified as a MODU, a mobile offshore drilling unit. Unlike fixed platforms that were anchored to the seabed, this rig was semi-submersible and floated on pontoons. It could be moved from one drilling location to another and had the capability to operate autonomously once on site. What set Deepwater Horizon apart was its dynamic positioning system, a sophisticated network of thrusters and GPS that allowed the rig to stay precisely over a wellhead without being anchored to the sea floor. It was a marvel of engineering, capable of holding its position in open water even under rough sea conditions. At the heart of the rig's operations was its blowout preventer. The BOP was the last line of defence in case something went wrong with the well. The BOP could be activated to close it off, preventing oil or gas from escaping into the ocean. This piece of equipment would prove to be critical and tragically flawed, and we will get into why shortly. Deepwater Horizon wasn't just a feat of engineering, it was also a floating city. The rig was equipped with everything its crew of 126 people needed to live and work for weeks or even months at a time. There were living quarters, a gym, recreation rooms, and a helipad for transporting personnel and supplies. The crew worked in 12-hour shifts around the clock, manning the drilling operations and maintaining the rig. The living conditions were designed to provide some comfort in the harsh, isolated environment of the open sea. Far, far, far from any shore. The rig's advanced capabilities made it highly sought after by major oil companies, including BP, one of the largest oil and gas companies in the world. BP had actually leased Deepwater Horizon from Transocean for the express purpose of drilling in the Macondo Prospect, an oil field located in the Gulf of Mexico, about 41 miles off of the coast of Louisiana. The Macondo well represented a massive untapped reservoir of oil, and BP was more than eager to get their grubby little hands on it. By the time BP took over the lease for Deepwater Horizon, the cost of operating the rig had risen to an astounding $500,000 per day. Every day of operation added to BP's expenses, and time was quite literally money. The lease was originally signed for a 3-year contract, and the rig's work in the Gulf of Mexico was crucial for BP's deepwater exploration strategy. Despite its cutting-edge design, Deepwater Horizon was not immune to the challenges of deepwater drilling. In 2009, the rig had undergone several upgrades and modifications. These included enhancements to its dynamic positioning system, improved safety protocols, and a series of inspections to ensure that the rig was in prime operating condition. The rig had been involved in several successful drilling operations, including a 2009 world record for drilling the deepest oil and gas well in history. This well, located off the coast of India, reached a depth of 35,050 feet, a testament to the rig's capabilities. Deepwater Horizon's reputation was one of excellence, precision, and cutting-edge technology. It has been recognised with awards and accolades within the industry for its achievements in deepwater exploration. The rig was seen as a symbol of what the oil industry could achieve when the boundaries of technology and human ingenuity were pushed to their limits. However, as it operated in ever deeper and more challenging environments, the risks became greater. By early 2010, Deepwater Horizon had been stationed at the Macondo prospect for several months. BP was eager to complete the well, which was proving to be a lot more challenging than expected. The Macondo well was located in nearly 5,000 feet of water, and the rock formations beneath the seabed were proving to be rather difficult to drill through. Time delays and cost overruns plagued the project, and pressure was mounting to finish the job. BP and Transocean had already invested hundreds of millions of dollars into this operation, and every additional day of drilling just added even more costs. Drilling in deep water involved managing intense pressures, both geological and operational. Beneath the ocean floor, immense forces built up, threatening to cause blowouts if not properly controlled. To mitigate these risks, crews relied on a combination of drilling muds, specialised equipment, and constant monitoring. Safety systems like the BOP were designed to act as a fail-safe, shutting down the well if something went wrong. However, in the world of deep water drilling, even the smallest mistake can lead to disaster. As the days stretched into weeks, the pressure to complete the well grew. Decisions were made to cut costs and to save time, and in operations that require high precision, that is usually a very, very bad idea. The rig, the well, and the people involved in it were all part of a high-stakes game, where every single decision carried immense risk. What no one knew at the time was that this project, like many others before it, was teetering on the edge of catastrophe. Soon, Deepwater Horizon was about to become a name that the entire world would know. The rig had been drilling the Macondo well for months, trying to tap into the vast oil reserves hidden 18,000 feet below the ocean floor. But the well was problematic from the start. BP, Transocean, and Halliburton, the company responsible for cementing the well, faced delays, cost overruns, and mounting pressure to finish the job. April 20th, 2010 was supposed to be a turning point. The crew had completed drilling, and they were in the process of temporarily abandoning the well, sealing it off so that a production rig could return to extract the oil. But this was also when critical decisions, some made weeks before, would set the stage for disaster. In deepwater drilling, one of the most dangerous risks, as we have discussed, is a blowout, an uncontrolled release of oil or gas from the well itself due to a failure in controlling the pressure. You see, a blowout occurs when the pressure inside the well becomes stronger than the weight of the drilling fluids used to contain it, or even the ocean itself holding it down. On Deepwater Horizon, several decisions contributed to a situation where this particular risk became deadly. One of the central issues was cementing. Halliburton had been contacted to seal the Macondo well by pumping a special cement mixture into the bottom of the wellbore. The cement's job was to keep oil and gas from escaping up the well. But tests showed potential problems with the cement, but these warnings were reportedly ignored. Halliburton had conducted a test on the cement stability, but the results were inconclusive. And yet, the job went ahead anyway, without waiting for a proper assessment. Another critical issue was the negative pressure test, designed to check whether the well was properly sealed. On the morning of April the 20th, the crew conducted the test, and while the results were ambiguous, showing fluctuating pressure readings that indicated a possible leakage, BP's team on board chose to proceed with operations. Donald Vidrine, BP's well site leader, and Robert Kaluza, another BP manager, were responsible for making key decisions during this phase. And despite signs of trouble, the decision was made to continue. Later investigations revealed that both Vidrine and Kaluza faced intense pressure to complete the well on time and within budget. The project was already behind schedule, costing BP an additional $500,000 per day. These financial pressures may have contributed to their decision to move forward, even though the well's condition was far from secure. As Mark Haffel, a senior drilling engineer at BP, later said in his testimony, there were signs that the well was not in a safe condition, but those signs were ignored. At approximately 7:45 p.m. on April the 20th, catastrophe struck. High-pressure methane gas surged up the wellbore past the faulty cement and into the drilling riser, a pipe that connected the rig to the wellhead on the seabed. This type of rapid, uncontrolled release of gas was precisely what the blowout preventer was designed to stop. The BOP, an enormous stack of valves weighing hundreds of tons, sat on the ocean floor, directly on top of the wellhead. Its job was to close off the well in the event of a blowout, cutting through the drill pipe and sealing the well shut. However, on this fateful day, the BOP failed. The exact reasons why remain unclear, but investigations later revealed that the device had not been properly maintained, and one of its critical components, called a dead battery, was non-functional. The gas reached the surface and ignited. The Deepwater Horizon rig was immediately engulfed in flames. The explosion was so powerful that it knocked out communication systems, leaving the crew on board fighting for their lives. On the bridge, Captain Kurt Kushta and the rig's senior staff scrambled to make sense of the situation. They activated the emergency disconnect system designed to sever the connection between the rig and the wellhead to prevent further damage. But the blowout was already too far gone. Over the next 2 days, Deepwater Horizon remained ablaze. Firefighting ships arrived on the scene, but their efforts were in vain. The rig, now tilting precariously, was beyond saving. The immediate aftermath on board the rig was a chaotic scramble for survival. As flames engulfed the rig, workers had to make split-second decisions that would determine life or death. Survivors later recounted the harrowing moments right after the explosion. Mike Williams, the rig's chief electronics technician, described how he was thrown across a room by the blast. Dazed and injured, he crawled to the edge of the rig, where he was faced with a serious choice. Stay on the burning platform or jump 10 stories into the oil-slicked, flaming waters below. Williams, like many others, chose the latter, when he said, "I remember pushing off and just free-falling. The fire was right behind me." Others, like crane operator Jason Anderson, stayed behind, heroically attempting to shut down the well manually to prevent further destruction. Tragically, Anderson and 10 others did not survive. Survival depended not just on instinct, but also on pure luck. Some workers managed to find lifeboats amid the smoke and the chaos, and a group of survivors crowded into the lifeboats and were eventually lowered into the sea, praying the lifeboats themselves wouldn't catch fire in the process. For those unlucky ones who couldn't reach the boats, doing a leap of faith into the ocean was the only option. Workers scrambled into the water, some of them clinging to debris, while others were struggling to stay afloat in the oil-filled sea. Some survivors recounted narrowly avoiding being sucked into the fire by the explosion's vortex. One worker described how he was pulled into the water by another crew member after losing grip of a ladder. He watched helplessly as others were consumed by the flames as they tried to escape. Another crew member was flung into the sea with such force by the blast that he had to fight his way back to the surface while choking on oil and other debris. The rescue efforts were immediate but riddled with complications. The Coast Guard dispatched helicopters and boats to the scene, working tirelessly to locate and rescue the survivors. Within hours, they were able to pull many from the water. But locating everyone proved to be a very difficult task because the ocean was black and so were the guys that were floating in it, which made them very, very difficult to spot. Firefighting ships tried to extinguish the blaze, but the sheer scale of the inferno rendered their efforts futile. Some rescuers were even forced to retreat due to the intense heat and the further risk of explosions from the volatile gas still seeping from the well. Rescue operations were hampered by a lack of coordination between various agencies and BP. There were delays in communication, and some rescuers found themselves without the proper equipment to deal with such a massive industrial fire. And as if things just could not get any fucking worse, human error peaked its head. One of the most significant errors occurred when a firefighting ship mistakenly sprayed water into the rig's exhaust system, making the situation worse by feeding the flames rather than quelling them. A clear lack of preparation and coordination between the response teams added layers of chaos to an already catastrophic situation. The scene was nothing short of a nightmare of rescuers battling flames, survivors scrambling in the oil-slicked water trying to survive, and vital time lost due to poor decision-making. Despite all of the fuck-ups, by the second day, most of the survivors had been rescued. Then, on the morning of April 22nd, 2010, it happened. Deepwater Horizon fucking sank into the Gulf of Mexico, disappearing beneath the surface. The rig's once proud frame now resting 5,000 feet below the water, right at the very bottom of the ocean. As Deepwater Horizon sank, it left behind a legacy of environmental destruction that would dwarf anything the oil industry had ever faced before. The collapse of the rig was just the beginning, as the environmental consequences very soon spiraled out of control, marking one of the worst man-made environmental disasters in history. What followed was an oil spill of epic proportions, one that would spill millions of barrels of crude oil into the waters of the Gulf, threatening marine life, local economies, and the livelihoods of thousands of people. The disaster would become one of the worst environmental catastrophes in human history. When Deepwater Horizon sank, the well it had been drilling, the MOTHERWELL, was left just gushing oil into the Gulf of Mexico completely unchecked. The rig's blowout preventer, the BOP, which should have automatically sealed off the well after the explosion, had catastrophically failed. Engineers, scientists, and government officials were scrambling to find a solution to stop the flow of oil, but as the days passed, the world began to realise just how difficult that would be. You see, the problem was the sheer depth of the well. Located over 5,000 feet below the surface, the MOTHERWELL was far beyond the reach of traditional methods of containment. This wasn't like an oil spill on land or in shallow waters, this was deep sea territory. Robots and remotely operated vehicles were sent down to the seafloor to try and activate the BOP, but their efforts were unsuccessful. The complex machinery of the BOP, designed to prevent exactly this kind of disaster, had been rendered useless by a combination of equipment failures and human error. As oil continued to pour into the Gulf, estimates of the flow rate began to rise. Initially, BP and government officials reported that 1,000 barrels of oil per day were leaking into the water. But within weeks, independent scientists were suggesting that that number could be much higher. By June, estimates had skyrocketed to 60,000 barrels per day, the equivalent of nearly 2.5 million gallons of oil being spilled into the Gulf every 24 hours. For 87 days, the well spewed oil into the water, releasing a total of 4.9 million barrels, or approximately 210 million gallons of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico before it was finally sealed. The impact of the oil spill on the environment was absolutely devastating. The Gulf of Mexico is home to a complex and delicate ecosystem teeming with marine life from fish and sea turtles to dolphins and whales. The Macondo well was located near vital fishing grounds, coral reefs and marshlands, all of which were now at risk as the oil slick spread across the water. Oil quickly began washing ashore along the coastlines of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama and Florida. The beaches, once pristine, were now coated in thick black sludge. Birds covered in oil were struggling to fly, while sea turtles and marine mammals suffocated as they became entangled in the toxic mess. The sight of dolphins and pelicans drenched in oil became an iconic image of the disaster, symbolising the immense toll that the spill was taking on the local wildlife. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported that the spill had actually created a dead zone in the Gulf, an area where oxygen levels in the water were so low that no marine life could survive. The oil had not only killed countless animals on contact, but it had also destroyed the habitats that they relied on to live and breed. One of the most tragic effects of the spill was its impact on endangered species. The Gulf of Mexico is a critical habitat for several species of sea turtles, including the Kemp's Ridley turtle, the most endangered sea turtle in the world. During the height of the spill, hundreds of these turtles were found dead, their bodies covered in oil. Conservationists feared that the already fragile population could be driven to the brink of extinction. Fish populations were also decimated. The Gulf itself is a breeding ground for numerous species of fish, including shrimp, red snapper, and bluefin tuna, key species for both the marine ecosystem and the region's fishing industry. As oil infiltrated the water column, it disrupted the reproductive cycles of these species, causing massive declines in their numbers. Basically, everything marine life related was completely fucked. And to make things even worse than they already are, BP's use of chemical dispersants raised serious environmental concerns. To combat the spill, BP dumped millions of gallons of a chemical dispersant called Corexit into the Gulf, hoping to break up the oil and make it easier to manage. But Corexit itself is toxic. While it did succeed in breaking the oil in the water into smaller droplets, it also introduced another layer of toxicity into the water, even further harming marine life and potentially making the oil more difficult to remove. The long-term effects of Corexit on the Gulf ecosystem are still being studied to this day. But many scientists believe that the combination of oil and dispersants created a toxic soup that would take decades to recover from. But it was not just a marine life disaster. The Gulf Coast is home to a thriving fishing and tourism industry, both of which were absolutely decimated by the spill. The fishing industry, which brings in billions of dollars every year, was effectively completely shut down because fisheries were closed because the seafood had become contaminated. Fishermen who had relied on the Gulf for generations suddenly found themselves without a livelihood. And even once the waters were declared safe for fishing, many consumers were hesitant to buy any seafood that was caught in the Gulf, fearing contamination or poisoning from the spill. The tourism industry was also hit very hard. The Gulf Coast beaches, a major draw for tourists all over the world, were now completely covered in oil. Hotels, restaurants and small businesses that depended on beachgoers saw their revenues plummet. Communities that had already been struggling from the effects of Hurricane Katrina 5 years earlier were now facing even more economic problems. BP was forced to set up a $20 billion compensation fund to help those that were affected by the spill. But for many, the damage was already done. Businesses closed, jobs were lost, and entire communities were left struggling to recover. While the environmental and economic impacts mounted, efforts to contain the spill were frantic and largely unsuccessful. For weeks, BP tried and failed to stop the flow of oil. Engineers attempted several methods, including the now infamous top kill operation, which involved pumping heavy drilling mud into the well in an attempt to block the flow of oil. But like many other efforts, it failed. Public frustration with BP and the US government grew as the days turned into weeks, and still the oil continued to flow. BP CEO Tony Hayward became the central figure for criticism. His infamous statement during the height of the crisis, "I'd like my life back," was widely condemned as rather tone-deaf, considering the sheer scale of the disaster and the suffering of the affected communities. And finally, on July the 15th, 2010, after 87 long days of the non-stop flow of millions and millions of barrels of oil, BP was finally able to cap the well. The relief well, drilled parallel to the original Macondo well, allowed engineers to pump cement into the leaking well, sealing it off for good. But by this time, the damage had already been done. The legal and political fallout from the Deepwater Horizon disaster was monumental. Investigations were launched by both the US government and independent agencies to determine just how such a catastrophe could even have occurred. The National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling, set up by then President Obama, released a report in early 2011 that outlined a series of critical errors made by BP, Transocean, and Halliburton. And the Commission's findings were damning. It concluded that BP had prioritised speed and cost cutting over safety. The company had ignored warnings from its own engineers and failed to follow basic fucking industry standards. The report also highlighted systemic issues within the oil industry, pointing to a culture of risk-taking and inadequate regulatory oversight. In 2012, BP reached a $4 billion settlement with the US Department of Justice, the largest criminal settlement in US history at the time. The company pleaded guilty to all 11 felony counts related to the deaths of the crew members, as well as charges of lying to Congress about the size of the spill. And if that wasn't enough, BP faced thousands of lawsuits from affected individuals, businesses, and environmental groups. The company agreed to pay over $18.7 billion in civil penalties and damages, the largest environmental settlement in US history. The Deepwater Horizon disaster inspired several parodies, documentaries, and films, often focusing on either the tragedy itself or its larger implications for corporate responsibility and environmentalism. A few examples being the 2016 movie Deepwater Horizon with Mark Wahlberg and Kurt Russell, the famous South Park parody of Tony Hayward's campaign, "We're sorry," and also my personal favourite, the Onion article with the headline, "Massive flow of bullshit continues to gush from BP headquarters," and that one's my favourite because it reminds me of a time when the Onion was funny. And more than a decade later, the Gulf of Mexico is still recovering from the Deepwater Horizon spill. The full extent of the environmental damage still remains unclear, as oil persists in the environment and scientists continue to study its effects on marine life and ecosystems. Some species have made a comeback, but others, like the Kemp's Ridley sea turtle, are still struggling. The spill also prompted changes in the oil industry. New regulations were put in place to improve safety standards for offshore drilling, including stricter oversight of blowout preventers and emergency response plans. The US government, through agencies like the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, implemented new rules designed to prevent another disaster of this scale. Stricter guidelines on well design, real-time monitoring of drilling activities, and more rigorous testing of safety equipment were all introduced. But many experts warn that the risks of deepwater drilling remain, and the lessons learned from Deepwater Horizon might not be enough. While you can argue that regulations have since changed, the inherent risks of drilling at extreme depths cannot be fully mitigated by technology alone. As Richard Charter, a senior at the Ocean Foundation, said, "The deeper you go, the higher the stakes." And while the oil industry has tried to reassure everyone that it's now safer than ever, you can't help but notice that it's like putting a band-aid on a blowout. Sure, the band-aid might help for 2 minutes, but when the oil comes gushing out again and wipes out millions of animals and wipes out species and turns our beaches into giant piles of toxic sludge, the next time it happens, you better do a lot better than, "We're sorry."
It's Count Dankula on YouTube! Everybody should subscribe!
Remember to use my link and download Raid Shadow Legends.